The FBI was consulted, but with no sign of forced entry or ransom, jurisdiction stayed with Denver police. Inside the airport, employees began circulating petitions demanding improved security checks. American Skyways printed posters with Melissa's face and the words, "Missing. Last seen November 18th. They hung in crew lounges and break rooms across the country. Public reaction came fast and emotional. Travelers left flowers near the employee entrance. Flight attendants across multiple airlines shared her story online, using early social media threads to keep her name visible. One of her colleagues told a reporter, "She was the one who made sure the rest of us got home safe. Now she's the one who didn't." Meanwhile, the investigation reached a standstill. With no footage and no signal, detectives turned to internal access logs. They found something odd. A maintenance employee's badge had been used at the same secured door only minutes after Melissa's card stopped working. The employee, a technician assigned to camera repairs, told investigators he was doing electrical checks that day. But there were no work orders scheduled for that area, and his name appeared nowhere in the maintenance log for that shift. Even so, the evidence wasn't enough to charge anyone. There was no body, no crime scene, and no direct proof of foul play. The search extended to nearby hotels, parking lots, even drainage systems beneath the terminal. Nothing. Days turned into weeks. The trail ended exactly where the cameras went dark, at the West Cargo Corridor. By the third day, the case consumed national media cycles. Commentators debated whether Melissa had been abducted, targeted, or possibly left voluntarily, though those who knew her said she never would. Still, speculation grew louder than facts. Through all the coverage, 3 details refused to fade. The 16-minute window between her last sighting and her badge shutdown. The one camera out of hundreds that had conveniently failed, and the single access point tied to an employee with no assigned duties there. That combination, timing, access, and silence, would define the investigation for years to come. By the end of that first week, one headline summed up the public disbelief. If she never left the airport, then where did she go? The question hung over Denver International Airport like an echo that wouldn't stop. It marked the beginning of one of Colorado's most haunting cold cases, and the start of a search that would push one family far beyond grief into a decade-long fight for answers. Before investigators could find out where Melissa Carter went, they had to understand who she was. Melissa wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to vanish without a trace. She lived her life by schedules, departure times, flight rotations, crew rosters. Every hour, every minute, accounted for. That's what made her disappearance so hard to believe. Born in 1974 in Boise, Idaho, Melissa was the only child of Dorothy and Frank Carter, 2 public school teachers who believed in hard work and quiet discipline. She grew up in a modest home with books stacked on every table and maps pinned to every wall. Her father taught geography, and on weekends the family would take road trips just to see where the highway would end. That's where her love for travel began. At the University of Washington, Melissa studied tourism and aviation management. She wasn't the loudest in class, but she was always prepared. Her friends used to joke that if the plane went down, Melissa would still have the emergency checklist memorized. Professors called her precise, respectful, and relentlessly organized. She graduated with honors and a clear goal: to work in the air. In 2000, she joined American Skyways, starting as a junior flight attendant. Within months, she became a crew favorite. Her supervisors trusted her. Her peers admired her. She was known for being calm during turbulence, kind to nervous passengers, and patient with new hires still figuring out how to balance trays in the aisle. One coworker said, "Melissa was the kind of person who made everyone else look better." Her attention to detail was legendary. Every flight, she logged the weather, crew shifts, and small observations, like what gate coffee shop had the shortest line, or which captain preferred decaf before takeoff. In 2006, she received the Crew Excellence Award for professionalism and leadership. No disciplinary marks, no passenger complaints. When other attendants rushed to clock out, she was the one doing a last sweep of the cabin to make sure nothing had been left behind. To those around her, Melissa was steady, predictable in the best way. She remembered birthdays, covered extra shifts, and brought small gifts for new crew members starting their first routes. She had a gentle sense of humor, the kind that made long layovers feel shorter. Her family adored her. Dorothy, her mother, still remembers the sound of the phone ringing every night after Melissa's flights landed. "She called every single time," Dorothy later said. "Even if it was 2 in the morning, she'd say, 'I'm on the ground, Mom, safe and tired. Talk tomorrow.'" For her mother, silence wasn't just unusual, it was unthinkable. At 33, Melissa lived in a quiet apartment complex in Aurora, Colorado, about 15 minutes from the airport. She had been dating Adam Reyes, an aircraft engineer she met during a maintenance training event 2 years earlier. They had plans to get engaged that Christmas. The ring was already chosen. They'd even toured homes near Seattle, where Melissa had been offered a position as a crew instructor for new flight attendants. Financially and emotionally, her life was in order. Rent paid on time, credit card balances low, no hidden debt, no signs of depression or burnout. Her work schedule was filled months in advance, with clear plans for holidays and family visits. Everything pointed toward stability, not escape. She lived by habits, the kind of small, steady rituals that defined her. She used the same black pilot pen and a leather-bound notebook to log every flight. She bought cappuccinos from the same coffee hut at Concourse B, always at the start of her layovers. And she never went anywhere without her silver watch, a gift from her mother after she finished training. Photos from every year of her career show it on her wrist, gleaming under the cabin light. The night before she vanished, she texted Adam a simple message: "See you in 2 days." There were no signs of tension, no unusual purchases, no calls that suggested fear or conflict. To everyone who knew her, she was the image of calm, a woman who loved her job, loved her partner, and loved being part of something structured and safe. That's why, when she missed her Seattle flight, her colleagues didn't panic at first. Maybe she'd switched schedules, maybe she was at another gate. But when her locker was opened, everything inside was untouched. Her wallet, phone, car keys, spare uniform, and notebook, all neatly in place. One attendant later said, "Melissa missing a flight was like the captain missing the plane. It just didn't happen." In aviation, abandoning a shift isn't just rare, it's almost unthinkable. Every minute of delay creates paperwork, accountability, and questions. No one who loved that job simply walked away. As the hours passed, word spread through the airport. By the next morning, soon the case became more than a mystery. It became a question of faith in safety itself. If someone could disappear inside one of America's most secure airports, what did that mean for everyone else? Still, detectives needed answers. They built theories, 3 of them: but none held up for long. The first was voluntary disappearance. Maybe Melissa had chosen to leave, escape stress, start over. But that theory collapsed under scrutiny. There were no cash withdrawals, no signs of secret planning, and no evidence she'd prepared to run. Her lease, utilities, and credit cards remained untouched. She hadn't packed a thing. To vanish willingly in the middle of a workday, leaving her phone and ID behind, simply didn't fit. The second theory was accidental injury. Perhaps she'd been trapped, fallen, or hurt inside some part of the airport infrastructure: baggage systems, maintenance tunnels, restricted areas. Teams swept storage rooms, stairwells, and underground service corridors for weeks. No sign. Her badge never scanned another door after 2:34 p.m., and there were no distress calls, alarms, or emergency logs. The environment itself ruled out an accident. That left the third theory: an inside job. The idea that someone with access and knowledge had made her disappear. At first it sounded like speculation, the kind of theory that always surfaces when technology fails. But there was one detail no one could ignore. The only broken camera in the entire terminal was the one covering the exact hallway where Melissa was last seen. It had stopped recording 3 days earlier and had been marked under maintenance, with no supervisor sign-off. The coincidence was too sharp to dismiss. Reporters asked the question aloud: was this really a system failure, or was it sabotage? Colleagues started voicing their own suspicions. Melissa had mentioned a maintenance worker who'd been a little too friendly in the weeks before she disappeared. There were no official complaints, just quiet remarks to friends. At the time it seemed trivial. Now it didn't. But even with mounting theories, nothing connected. No witnesses saw her leave. No one heard a struggle. The security system, built to... When investigators began combing through Denver International's security systems, they expected a glitch or a camera delay, something simple. What they found instead was one failure that mattered more than anything else. Out of hundreds of active cameras, only one had gone dark. Camera C-47, covering the West Service Corridor, the same hallway Melissa Carter walked into before disappearing. The camera had been offline for 3 days. The maintenance log said, "Awaiting parts." There was no supervisor signature, no attached photo of the repair, and no replacement order in the procurement system. It was the only blind spot in the entire terminal. From that moment, the case shifted from "where did she go" to "who made this possible?" Investigators rebuilt the last 30 minutes of Melissa's life, frame by frame. 2:18 p.m. She left the crew lounge, heading toward the concourse coffee stand. 2:26. She appeared on a hallway camera near the West Cargo Corridor. 2:32. The last working feed caught her walking toward the C-47 junction. At 2:34, her airport badge was remotely deactivated. 3 minutes later, at 2:37, another badge, belonging to Ryan Walsh, age 38, registered at the same door. Between 2:34 and 2:40, a power fluctuation hit the maintenance panel for that section, resetting several electrical logs. The badge system painted a clean picture. Melissa's access stopped cold. She never exited through any security gate, never scanned onto an employee shuttle, and never appeared in parking lot footage. The only person to swipe through those same doors in the minutes that followed was Ryan Walsh. a camera systems technician with full clearance for restricted corridors. Walsh's maintenance ticket didn't hold up. He had filed it 3 days earlier, citing a lens malfunction, claiming replacement parts were on order. But procurement had no record of that request, and the ticket ID matched one from a repair closed weeks before. It was an internal red flag. Reused paperwork meant to look legitimate. Witness statements added fragments to the picture. Ryan Walsh had access, more than almost anyone else in the building. His job gave him clearance to enter security camera rooms, adjust network terminals, and move through back corridors that ordinary employees never saw. He could disable cameras, override badge permissions, and log changes into the system without immediate oversight. He had the means, the opportunity, and the timing that matched the window of Melissa's last appearance. The digital audit confirmed it. On the morning of November 18th, Walsh had logged into the video management system twice, outside of his assigned hours. He didn't report those logins. He also accessed a subdirectory used for live feeds from Concourse C, including the now missing C-47 feed. It wasn't proof, but it was a pattern, one that looked less like coincidence and more like control. Forensics teams combed through the West Corridor days later. Swabs and surface tests came back clean. No blood, no fibers, nothing visible. The floor had been recently mopped. Fresh tire scuffs traced from a maintenance cart led toward a freight lift whose camera had also been offline due to the same outage. The team sprayed luminol, no reaction. It was as if the hallway had been scrubbed of time itself. Patterns started stacking in uncomfortable symmetry. Only one camera was down. Only one technician had the authority to disable it. Only one badge swiped through the same door moments after Melissa vanished. And only one facilities van had been parked near the cargo ramp during that period, registered to the maintenance department where Walsh worked. When detectives brought him in, Walsh said he'd been checking low-voltage lines and waiting for parts. There was no scheduled work order for that time, and no supervisor who could verify his presence in the corridor. He claimed not to know Melissa well, just a co-worker. The next day he called in sick, then requested a permanent shift change to late evenings, a schedule he'd never worked before. It didn't prove guilt, but it deepened the suspicion. Without a body, without a trace, police couldn't move fast. They couldn't justify a warrant. The evidence was circumstantial: a broken camera, a missing employee, and a technician who seemed just a little too comfortable around the system's blind spots. The airport officially labeled the case a suspicious disappearance. The Denver Police Department escalated it to the FBI's technical unit for help with badge forensics and data recovery from the camera network. Inside the briefing room, Dorothy Carter, Melissa's mother, was shown the final still image of her daughter walking toward the corner where the C-47 camera should have been recording. She didn't cry. She looked at the screen, then at the investigators, and asked one question. Who turned off the camera? It was simple, but it hit like a directive. From that point, every re-examination, every log review, every audit circled back to that same question. The deeper they dug, the more the case turned inward. This wasn't a random act in a public space. It wasn't an accident or a voluntary disappearance. It looked like an inside access event, planned, or at least executed, by someone who knew the system's weaknesses down to the minute. The idea disturbed everyone involved. Airports are designed to eliminate uncertainty. Every movement is logged, every zone recorded, every worker accounted for. But the disappearance of Melissa Carter exposed something else, the human element that no security system can predict. By the end of that year, the investigation hit a wall. The cameras stayed silent. The corridor stayed spotless. Ryan Walsh left his job a month later, citing personal reasons, and moved to a quiet suburb outside Aurora. The case file grew cold, but the suspicion never cooled. In the absence of evidence, all that remained were patterns, and one question that no one could yet answer. In a place built to track everything, how did one man find the perfect blind spot? 8 years had passed since Melissa Carter vanished from Denver International Airport. Her case had gone from headline news to a quiet file in storage, unsolved, untouched, and nearly forgotten. But in early 2015, a single letter changed everything. It came from her mother, Dorothy Carter, who had written one every month for nearly a decade. Most went unanswered. This one didn't. It landed on the desk of a new detective in Denver's cold case division. He read the line she always ended her letters with. "If a camera can fail, a system can fail. Check the people who controlled it." That sentence brought the case back to life. In May 2015, Denver's cold case unit officially reopened the investigation. The new team wasn't built on hope. It was built on technology. They brought in a data forensics expert, a geotechnical analyst, and 2 detectives who specialized in reconstructing unsolved cases from digital remains. Their plan was simple: retest every piece of evidence using tools that didn't exist in 2007. Advanced video mapping, badge system forensics, and ground-penetrating radar. The first task was re-examining every name tied to the C-47 corridor, the last place Melissa was seen. When they compiled the data, one name appeared 37 times. Ryan Walsh, technician, camera systems custodian, and the man responsible for maintaining the only camera that failed. Detectives started tracing his movements after 2007. He had resigned from Denver International a month after the disappearance. His exit paperwork listed personal reasons. He moved to Commerce City, a quiet suburb 9 miles from the airport, and bought a modest 2-story home. By 2010, after a divorce, he'd abandoned it completely. Property tax records stopped showing payments after 2011. The utility company's data told a strange story: intermittent electricity use, sudden spikes for short periods, then total silence. Neighbors described him as quiet, distant, and always tinkering with something mechanical. One said, "He was the kind of guy who never made eye contact, just nodded and kept walking." When investigators pulled his old maintenance logs from 2007, they noticed a pattern. Multiple security camera repairs marked parts pending. None had corresponding part orders. The same vague excuse used for camera C-47. The same signature. By August, the team had enough to request a warrant to scan the old Walsh property. On November 10, 2015, forensic technique. At sunrise on November 12th, the work began. The concrete was thick, and the newer patch resisted every drill bit. As the dust spread, the scent of damp earth filled the basement. Just before noon, one of the technicians stopped. Beneath the cracked layer, an air void opened, a small cavity sealed by industrial cement. Inside it were fabric fragments pressed into soil, a piece of metal warped by pressure, and bone. The team froze. They radioed command. The excavation turned into recovery. 12 hours later, the remains were sealed, photographed, and transported to Denver's forensic laboratory under 24-hour guard. DNA analysis began the next morning. Within 72 hours, the match came back, 100% confirmed. The remains were Melissa Carter, The forensic report went deeper. The threads from the recovered fabric contained a polyester blend exclusive to American Skyways uniforms issued in late 2007. Soil samples around the bones tested positive for the same industrial cement compound used by the airport's maintenance division, a mixture unavailable to the public. Even the dust under the slab carried traces of cleaning solution brands stocked only in the airport's custodial storage. Whoever buried her knew exactly what to use and where to get it. That link pointed straight back to Ryan Walsh. Detectives revisited the airport's warehouse records from 2007 and found an entry flagged as incomplete. Walsh had signed out a portable cement mixer and a 5-gallon container of concrete mix, both marked as unreturned. When they searched his old garage, the mixer was still there, covered in a tarp. Forensics lifted clear fingerprints that matched his personnel file. Cement residue inside the drum contained the same industrial markers as the sample from the burial site. Even his work gloves, left in a rusted toolbox, held microscopic traces of the same mix. By November 16th, the evidence chain was airtight. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't improvised. It was planned, executed by someone who knew exactly how to hide something inside concrete. 2 days later, after 12 hours, the denials gave way to excuses, then to fragments of a confession. He said Melissa came to the maintenance area that afternoon, said they argued after she brushed him off, claimed he lost control, hit her once, panicked, and moved her body with a maintenance van. He told them he buried her in the basement of his home, until I could figure out what to do. He never used the word murder. He called it an accident, a mistake, something that spiraled. But his description matched the physical evidence too closely to be coincidence. He mentioned pouring the cement that night, mixing it with leftover material from work. Investigators asked who helped. He hesitated, then said, "My brother Kevin." He thought it was just trash. By dawn, the confession was on record. The investigators had what they needed: motive, means, and method, all confirmed by science. When news broke that afternoon, Dorothy Carter received a call from Denver PD. The officer on the line said, "Mrs. Carter, we found her." For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she asked, "Are you sure?" The officer said, "We're sure." That basement in Commerce City became the final piece of a story that had haunted the city for nearly a decade. Police filed their final report in clear, clinical language. Victim, Melissa Carter. Cause, blunt force trauma. Manner, homicide. Concealment, intentional. Location, residence of airport employee Ryan Walsh. 9 years after the day she disappeared, the truth was no longer hidden under concrete. It was in evidence bags, DNA reports, and fingerprint scans. Undeniable and permanent. For Dorothy Carter, it was the end of a search and the beginning of justice. For investigators, it was proof that persistence, pressure, and modern science could reach through time and pull a secret straight out of the ground. The disappearance of Melissa Carter was no longer a mystery. It was a murder. And the man who once controlled the airport's cameras could no longer hide behind the blind spot he created. The arrest came quietly, but the impact was seismic. Ryan's expression didn't change. He leaned back, stared at the wall, and said, "That's impossible." For the first hour, his story was complete denial. He said he barely knew Melissa, maybe twice in passing. He claimed he'd never even entered the West Service corridor where her badge last pinged. Then detectives slid a single document across the table: badge access logs. 2 names: Melissa Carter, 2:34 p.m. Ryan Walsh, 2:37 p.m. The same door, the same camera outage. He swallowed, then said, "I was checking a wiring issue." The detectives moved to the first layer of evidence: photos of the ground-penetrating radar scan, images of the excavation, a cross-section of concrete, tagged and labeled, lab reports confirming the industrial cement formula matched the same batch used in airport maintenance in 2007. Ryan blinked, looked at the ceiling and muttered, "That doesn't mean anything." The second layer came next: the unreturned portable mixer recovered from his garage, fingerprints matching his HR record, dust samples tying its residue to the cement around Melissa's remains. His old gloves, kept for years in a rusted toolbox, still held microscopic traces of the same compound. Then the third layer: a piece of blue polyester, American Skyways uniform fabric, batch issued the year Melissa disappeared. A warped name badge recovered near the remains. And the DNA report, mitochondrial match confirmed against Dorothy Carter's sample. The room fell quiet. Ryan asked for a break. When he returned, something had shifted. He no longer denied knowing Melissa. He called it a misunderstanding, said she was upset, repeated that he lost control. He never said hit, he never said kill, only panic, accident, and it wasn't supposed to happen. Piece by piece, the confession began to form. He said it happened near gate C-47, in a maintenance bay she wasn't supposed to enter. He described a single strike, a flashlight, then freezing up. He said he used a facilities van to move her body after hours, driving straight to his Commerce City home. There, he poured concrete from leftover airport stock to cover the mistake. When pressed on logistics, he hesitated, then brought up his younger brother, Kevin Walsh. He helped clean up, he said. He didn't know what it was. Detectives traced a hardware store receipt from that night, Kevin's debit card, timestamped 9:22 p.m., for 3 additional bags of concrete. Then came Laura Walsh, Ryan's wife at the time. Follow-up interviews and subpoenaed voicemails revealed that she'd been at the house days later. One voicemail to Ryan said, "Stop talking about the basement." Another, "You promised this was over." Detectives marked her for obstruction. By the end of the week, the district attorney's office assembled the case file. 214 pages of evidence, photos, and transcriptions. The charges were laid out clearly. Ryan Walsh, first-degree murder, tampering with a deceased person, abuse of a corpse. Kevin Walsh, accessory after the fact, evidence tampering. Laura Walsh, obstruction of justice, accessory to tampering. At arraignment, Ryan was denied bail. Prosecutors cited flight risk, technical expertise, and access to restricted systems. Kevin was granted conditional release under GPS monitoring. Laura, cooperative after questioning, was released pending trial. Over the next few months, the DA built leverage through evidence and plea pressure. With the confession recorded, fingerprints tied to the mixer, and forensic chains fully intact, there was no room for doubt. Prosecutors refused any reduction for Ryan. Kevin's lawyer opened negotiations for a cooperation agreement. Laura's attorney worked toward a plea to obstruction, probation instead of prison. The grand jury convened in January 2016. Over 3 days, they heard testimony from detectives, lab analysts, and airport security officials. The badge timeline, the camera outage, the van sighting at the cargo ramp, the cement match. The jurors returned true bills on all counts. Ryan's defense tried to suppress his confession, arguing exhaustion and coercion. The court reviewed the footage, clear, calm, and voluntary. Motion denied. The confession stood. In the end, the outcomes were inevitable. Ryan Walsh entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder to avoid a public trial. He was sentenced to life without parole. Kevin Walsh pleaded to accessory and evidence tampering, receiving 12 years with credit for cooperation. Laura Walsh pleaded to obstruction, receiving 3 years probation and mandatory testimony at her husband's sentencing. In court, Dorothy Carter sat in the front row, a framed photo of Melissa in her hands. She didn't cry. When the sentence was read, she stood, steady, as the judge addressed the court. He called it a crime built on access, arrogance, and the illusion of control. When Dorothy was invited to speak, she said only one thing. "You took our time." The truth gives some of it back. The courtroom was silent. That day the case file was finally reclassified, from missing person to closed homicide, from unknown to convicted. The evidence that once lived in folders and forensic reports was now part of public record. And for the first time in nearly a decade, the Denver Police Department archived the Carter file, not as an open question, but as an answer. Melissa Carter's name moved from the list of unresolved disappearances to the list of solved homicides. Ryan Walsh, the man who once maintained the airport's security systems, now lived inside one, a maximum security facility built on locked doors, cameras, and concrete he couldn't control. Justice, after 9 long years, had finally caught up. After the verdict, Denver International Airport could no longer claim ignorance. The headlines had already said what everyone was thinking. A woman had vanished inside one of the most secure facilities in the country, and nobody stopped it from happening. Within days of the conviction, the airport's leadership announced an internal audit. It wouldn't just look at one department, but at every layer of the system that was supposed to keep people safe. The findings were harsh. 5 separate procedural failures made Melissa Carter's disappearance possible. A camera left offline without oversight. A maintenance sign-off system that relied on one person's word. Delayed badge deactivations that left doors open to abuse. Poor corridor visibility. And no supervisor required to verify high-risk repair zones. A leaked summary report put it in the plainest words possible. One blind spot became a murder zone. The lines spread across news networks within hours. The city of Denver moved next. A full-scale investigation was ordered by the Federal Aviation Security Board. Out of that came the first real reform, the "no one works alone" rule. Denver implemented it immediately. From then on, no technician, custodian, or inspector could work alone in a restricted zone. Every shift had to be paired. Every repair had to be cross-verified. It didn't stop there. The FAA and TSA both adopted the same rule within a year, calling it the Dual Access Protocol. Every technician in a U.S. airport would now undergo rescreening and background checks twice a year. The change closed the exact loophole Ryan Walsh had used, the ability to act alone, unseen. The ripple spread fast. Atlanta, Los Angeles, Chicago O'Hare, all began rewriting their own maintenance policies. American Skyways, the airline Melissa worked for, created a program called Crew Safety Awareness. It trained flight attendants and ground staff to identify concerning coworker behavior and irregular badge use. Airlines began integrating reporting apps directly into crew tablets, letting staff alert security with a single tap if they saw something off. Industry experts later admitted that the Carter case accelerated workplace safety modernization by nearly a decade. What should have been routine upgrades became national urgency. The media turned its attention from the courtroom to the system that failed her. The Denver Post ran the headline, "The Cost of Neglect, a Camera Down, a Life Lost." Editorials across the country echoed it. How could a federal-level facility lose someone in daylight? Congress briefly considered new legislation requiring all U.S. airports to conduct quarterly camera audits. While it never passed, the message landed. Across social media, airport employees began sharing their own experiences. Moments where they'd been assigned to work alone in low-traffic areas, ignored maintenance reports, or malfunctioning doors. The hashtag #safety means accountability trended for weeks. What started as anger evolved into a collective call for reform. People began to understand that safety wasn't just about machines. It was about responsibility. Inside Denver International, leadership made one final move that changed how future workers would think about the case. The airport partnered with the National Aviation Training Center to build a new course titled The Carter Case: Lessons in System Failure. Every new hire, from security guards to engineers, would study how one oversight, one broken camera, and one unchecked technician created a chain of failure that ended in murder. The FBI added the case to its Controlled Environment Investigation seminar, using it to teach detectives how to reconstruct movements through badge data and maintenance records years after a crime. In federal classrooms, the word Carter became shorthand for preventable compromise. The moment systems trusted too much in automation and too little in human accountability. By 2016, the Transportation Security Administration made the reform national. The Carter Protocol became official policy. Every U.S. airport, seaport, and federal facility was required to maintain real-time system health monitoring, dual authorization maintenance, and compliance audits every 180 days. It was the first time a single criminal case had rewritten standards across multiple transportation sectors. American Skyways honored Melissa's name through action, funding the Melissa Carter Memorial Grant, a scholarship for students studying aviation safety and investigation. The grant carried a simple motto: safeguarding those who safeguard others. The story reached its most public moment in a Denver ceremony months later. Officials gathered to sign the new airport safety bill. When Dorothy Carter was invited to attend, she stood quietly as her and her late husband's names were read as citizens whose persistence led to reform. When she saw her daughter's name engraved in the summary of the law, her hands trembled. For the first time in 9 years, she smiled. Not because justice was served, but because something lasting had come from loss. National broadcasts that evening summarized it in one line: a camera failed, a woman vanished. The nation learned. Inside the staff lounge at Denver International, near the corridor that no longer existed, a plaque was mounted on the wall. It read, "In memory of Melissa Carter, Her loss rebuilt our vigilance. Employees pass it every day. New recruits stop to read it during orientation. To them, it's not just a memorial. It's a reminder of what can happen when procedure becomes habit, and no one asks who's watching. What began as one woman's unexplained disappearance became a turning point for national safety reform. The investigation had ended in a courtroom, but its echo reached far beyond, into training manuals, security systems, and policy books. Melissa Carter's story changed how America's airports thought about risk. In the years that followed, officials would say the same thing whenever they spoke up. NBC released a full-length Dateline special titled "Vanished in Plain Sight." It aired 3 months after sentencing and quickly became one of the network's most-watched true crime episodes of the year. The episode traced the entire investigation, from Melissa's final walk through the terminal to the discovery beneath the concrete basement, using surveillance footage, police reports, and interviews with investigators. The title alone captured what unsettled the public most: that a woman could vanish inside one of the most secure buildings in the country, and no one noticed until it was too late. Major outlets joined in. The New York Times, CNN, Denver Post, and The Guardian ran long-form features about the case. Editorials called it the case that forced America to look inside its airports. True crime podcasts like Crime Beat and The Dark Line produced multi-part investigations, exploring not only the crime but the system that allowed it to happen. For once, coverage didn't glorify the killer. It exposed the weakness of a structure trusted to protect its workers. Then came the moment that pushed the story from news to movement. Dorothy Carter, quiet, deliberate, and stronger than anyone realized, appeared on Good Morning America. She didn't cry or dramatize the loss. She just said calmly, "I wasn't fighting a man. I was fighting silence, and silence is what lets things like this happen." Those words caught fire. Within days, her interview was trending nationwide. Letters poured in from flight attendants, airport mechanics, and mothers of missing children. She had become the human face of persistence, not a symbol of revenge, but of accountability. Across social media, the old hashtag number sign, "Where is Melissa?" came back to life. This time it wasn't about finding her. It was about making sure no one else could disappear without being seen. Thousands of aviation workers shared stories of ignored safety complaints and unsafe work zones. Airlines responded by launching new hotlines for misconduct reports, and advocacy groups used the case to demand mandatory oversight for maintenance teams. One national columnist summed it up best: "Corporate silence can be as dangerous as criminal intent." Inside Denver International Airport, the change became tangible. A framed photo of Melissa, smiling in her uniform, was hung in the crew lounge. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "For every flight attendant who never made it home." Every November 18th, co-workers left flowers beneath it. Soon, other airports joined in. Ribbons at Seattle, small bouquets in Dallas, a candle at LAX. It became an unspoken tradition across the aviation world. In 2021, 6 years after sentencing, Ryan Walsh was found dead in prison. Officials ruled natural causes. For the Carter family, it was closure without emotion. The focus had long shifted to what his actions exposed, not how his life ended. By then, the case had already entered classrooms. The FBI used it in forensic seminars to demonstrate how data logs and maintenance records could rebuild a timeline without witnesses. Aviation schools taught the Carter case in ethics and security programs. Investigators called it a model of resolution without recovery, a blueprint for how modern forensic work could solve the unsolved. The broader impact followed quickly. Within a year of the reforms, employee reporting across major airports rose by double digits. The National Transportation Safety Board cited Melissa's case in a 2017 statement on human accountability in controlled access environments. What started as a local tragedy had rewritten how an entire industry thought about trust and responsibility. When the story resurfaced in anniversary specials, news anchors often closed with the same line: "She vanished in silence." But what followed made the whole nation listen. For Dorothy Carter, awareness, not justice, became the point. She told one reporter, "Justice doesn't end with a sentence. It ends when people stop pretending it can't happen again." The final scene that stayed with viewers wasn't from the trial or the crime scene. It was the Denver runway at dusk. Planes lifting off one by one, their lights fading into the clouds. Melissa's name no longer belonged to a cold case file. It had become part of a national memory. A reminder that vigilance has a cost, and that sometimes change begins only when the silence breaks. After the trial ended and the headlines faded, Dorothy Carter refused to disappear with them. She turned her grief into purpose, founding the Melissa Foundation, an organization built to help families facing workplace disappearances and to train employees to recognize danger before it turns into tragedy. The foundation worked quietly but effectively, funding private searches, offering legal guidance, and teaching companies how to handle internal threats. By 2018, the Foundation's workshops reached more than 30 airports across the country. The Safe Shift program, taught by former investigators from the case, trained airline crews to identify warning signs of obsession or harassment among coworkers. Dorothy often attended the sessions in silence, sitting in the back, watching as her daughter's name appeared on training slides used by the same institutions that once failed her. American Skyways created the Melissa Carter Memorial Scholarship, awarded to aviation students studying safety and ethics. Each recipient received a letter from Dorothy herself. "Your vigilance keeps others safe. That's the real legacy." Universities in Washington and Colorado made the scholarship permanent, and soon, Melissa's name was tied not to tragedy, but to education and prevention. By 2019, the Carter case had entered the curriculum of FBI and TSA training programs. It was no longer just a file from the past. It had become a national model of how digital forensics and access logs could solve cases years after the fact. Within security circles, the phrase "Carter Standard" became shorthand for strict procedural accountability, a rule that every major airport adopted to prevent another silent failure. In 2020, during a memorial at Denver International, Dorothy spoke one final time. Standing beneath her daughter's portrait, she said, "Justice didn't give us peace, but it gave us truth. And that's enough." Her words stayed with everyone in the room, a reminder that truth can't erase pain, but it can stop silence from taking more lives. Each November 18th, flight attendants leave flowers beneath Melissa's photo. The plaque below reads, "They trusted the system. Now the system remembers them." Melissa's name now stands for vigilance, accountability, and quiet courage. Her story rebuilt a broken system and saved lives that will never know her face. If you believe every mystery deserves an answer, like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what justice means to you.